start. We are recording this for our YouTube channel. Welcome, everybody. This is Torkai, Toronto Kai chapter. Today is May 29th, and we are very excited to have Matt Gorbet with us. I met Matt in 2001 when he joined the CFC Media Lab as one of the faculty along with me, and we were working with Anna Serrano, who is now the president of OCAD University. So things have moved onwards and upwards, and we're very excited to see what Matt is going to share with us. And he just finished his doctorate in design, and he's going to share some of that work. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Alona, and thanks for inviting me. And it's lovely to see everybody here. And it's like a wonderful reunion. So many familiar faces, and I'm really looking forward to updating everybody on what's been going on. So I'm going to just share, and we'll see if this works as usual. Let's see if that is visible to people and everybody. Anybody see that? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. And I'm trying to also at the same time attempt to be able to see you at the same time. So I'm moving my mouse frantically to find all my windows, which is great UI for the Torkai crowd. Okay, so thanks so much for being here. And today, what I'm talking about today, it's funny, I put on my title slide, Dr. Matt Gorbet, DDes. I think that's probably the last time I'll ever do it, but I'm doing it for context today to put the doctor in front, because this is work that has come out of my my doctorate, which I've just finished after taking a 20-something year break from academia. I decided it was time to go back and to consolidate some of the things that I had been working on before. So I'm happy that you're here to look at it and experience it with me. I'm going to talk in 3 parts today. The first part is a little bit of a trip down memory lane, and you might recognize some people on this picture. In fact, one of you might recognize yourself. And we are going to talk a little bit about sort of this history, this idea of responsive environment and conceptions of responsive environments, particularly going back in a way that really surprised me as I started taking the lid back off of this and really looking back at the fundamentals. It actually took my research in a slightly different direction than it would have otherwise been, and it provided great context. So I hope to share that part with you. Part 2, I'm going to get into more clearly what I did and my contribution, what I've added, which is a new framework for thinking about the control and design of expressive objects in our built environment. So things that are in part of our architecture, part of our environment that can be expressive, poetic, and a new kind of way to imagine the infrastructure that that drives those. We'll talk about that in a bit. And the third part is more about the context in which this research was done, in that it was really shaped and in a large part validated by sort of extensive applications and installations over the past 5 years or so. I've been working with the Living Architecture Systems Group, and the Living Architecture Systems Group has been doing immersive sculptural installations all over the world, which are acting as research test beds to really validate and push forward with some of these ideas. So we'll talk about that kind of closer to the end. So let's get going. In thinking about conceptions of responsive environments, when many people, especially in the Kai community and in academia, think about responsive environments and talk about what is it to make or be a responsive environment, they often turn to this book, Soft Architecture Machines, Nicholas Negroponte, published in 1975 and finished in 1973, but we'll get to that. But the idea of responsive environment and a soft architecture, or a softer way of thinking about architecture, has really been popularized by this book. And a lot of people even look at the essay that's in this book called Responsive Architecture as maybe even the first or the beginning or the origin of this term. And a line can be drawn from there. And a lot of Kai papers, that's the sort of reference you get in the previous work part. So I picked it up as well, thinking, okay, let's go there. And it was in reading this and in looking at it and going a little bit further in the research that I really started to see some things that needed contextualizing. And it was in going into that I decided to actually go back another decade, from 1970 into the 1960s, and to look at architecture and conception of architecture then. And I found some surprising things that really helped inform my work and the way I think about this now and the way I'm thinking about it going forward. It was really resonant. So in the 1960s, in architectural circles, especially avant-garde sort of more philosophical architectural circles, the way people were thinking about technology was coming out of the 1950s, kind of a techno-utopian idea of technology being powerful and able to do a lot of things. It was the time of archigram and Western architecture, thinking about things like movable cities and robots you could live in, and also a growing awareness through the space program of things like our limited resources and the idea of life support systems. So houses and architecture as life support. And really the first sort of beginning to think, at least in Western circles, about this need for sustainability and this need for the fact that we have a limited ecological footprint. At the same time, there was also work like obviously the Fun Palace, Cedric Price and John Littlewood, thinking about cybernetics and architecture, Gordon Pask's involvement in that, and really starting to think about what it could be to be architecture as a system and architecture as a way of changing and moving to support its occupants. Third example here on this page is J.G. Ballard's novel, The Thousand Dreams of Stella Vista, which was really influenced by the advent of new materials in the 60s, plastics and things that could be formed and shaped and reshaped. So in this novel, we have houses that can move and change and transform and change color, and the walls can react to the occupants. And unfortunately, in Ballard's case, they were homicidal and it didn't end well. But people were starting to think about these things. They were starting to think about what would it be like to live where technology is part of our dwelling and part of our built environment. So John Fraser summed it up very well in writing in 1993, and actually in a book about Gordon Pask, in a paper about Gordon Pask. And the quote from John Fraser is, "Architectural thinking in the 60s was preoccupied with issues of flexibility, impermanence, prefabrication, computers, robotics, and a global approach to energy, resources, and culture." So these are the sort of preoccupations that were really lighting the fire in a lot of these really experimental architects. He goes on in that article to say, in a sense, this era closed with the publication by Negroponte of The Architecture Machine in 1970. When I read that, I was like, okay, well, wait, what does he mean and why? And how is that related? And it was only starting to look at that. It's true, Negroponte published two books. He published The Architecture Machine in 1970, building up from the work he had been doing, talking about the origins of ArchMac. And then in 1972, he finished Soft Architecture Machines, the other book that I showed you that's widely cited and hugely influential. So it's looking at these two books that I started to see some things that I found really interesting. In The Architecture Machine, I was really struck by this series of images. And it's extraordinary in the way it captures, just in 3 frames, the notion of what I think we're trying to do with responsive architecture and with moving new kinds of interfaces or new kinds of interaction into the built environment, going from something hard and controls and control panels and this kind of thing on the left to something that's more natural, more flexible, more pliable, and even perhaps more empathetic. Like, what would it mean to integrate technology in a way that actually made it more able to work with our humanity? And I think the subtitle of The Architecture Machine, that first book by Negroponte, was actually Towards a More Human Environment. So when I looked at these pictures, I thought, wow, that's great. But then I realized that the pictures weren't actually by Negroponte. They were actually published 3 years earlier in another paper by this gentleman, Warren Brody. And Warren Brody wrote a couple of really interesting articles in the 1960s. This one from IEEE magazine in 1967, Human Enhancement Through Evolutionary Technology, and a follow-up, a couple in the next issue, actually, that are really interesting to read right now because they integrated a lot of very sort of philosophical thinking about what would it be like to have AI and how should we think about AI and how will AI change the way cities are designed. He also wrote at the same time this paper called Soft Architecture, the Design of Intelligent Environments. And it speaks also about city design and environment design and how might people work with the technology-enabled environments. So Brody absolutely, quote from here, "We need an environment," Brody says, "which is more and more by us to have more of our kind of intelligence, our kind of behavior." This was his approach. But how can that be done? And why should it be done? So Brody's papers and Brody's thinking, Brody had started as a clinical psychologist. He had done a lot of work with child psychology. He was actually part of a group that was doing the first child and family therapy. And then he was very concerned with how we relate to one another, how we relate to our environment, how we relate to the people around us, and how technology can help enhance that, essentially. He moved to MIT and he became a researcher at MIT and an inventor. And he was very influential to Negroponte. So Negroponte, in fact, in his first book says, Warren Brody provided the theoretical foundations for many of the concepts contained in this book. And also later he says the reader should be referred to the important and ongoing work of Warren Brody and Avery Johnson. This was fascinating to me because I'd never heard of Warren Brody, but of course, Negroponte has been incredibly influential in technology and also in architecture. The interesting thing is when I looked back at soft architecture machines just a few years later, the quotes about Brody in this book are very different. Brody and Johnson, he says, I listened to Warren Brody and Avery Johnson. I share their interest in soft robots, but I see no evidence of progress or even potential. And then he says, neither Brody nor Johnson's paper, however, presents convincing examples or gives the slightest inkling of a picture or description of how such a system might work. The quotes he was giving, some researchers have pursued studies that have suffered in their very conception of taking the term soft too literally. Brody himself lived in a foam house, and his ex-partner, Johnson, plays with plastics. Not everybody wants to live in a balloon. So throughout the book, I found Negroponte's attitude toward this research that had so inspired him just a few years earlier had completely shifted. And I said to myself, what has happened here? And I started looking back through it, and I started kind of trying to do a little bit more research and piecing it together. This is only 4 of the 9 quotes, actually, that I ended up pulling out of this book to kind of make this point. And he had cited Brody 21 times in the previous book, and even included a dialogue with him as part of the book. So what was going on? In 1972, there was also a meeting convened right before the publication of this book called the Responsive House. It was a colloquium on architecture, and it brought together a lot of big thinkers in how technology and architecture might come together. And one of the people who published in that meeting was Avery Johnson, Brody's research partner. And Avery Johnson wrote a paper called The Three Little Pigs Revisited. And it was a bit of a manifesto about courteous architecture and how could we create spaces that were courteous and that pushed back against being sort of big brother, being sensors, knowing what's going on, centralized technology. And instead, Johnson was really advocating for something that was a lot more mutual and a lot more empathetic. And Brody and Johnson both sort of shared this view. And I think a lot of this started to inform Negroponte's thinking. They were really ideologically at other ends from each other. At that time, in 1970, Johnson and Brody had moved their research off of MIT, and they had started working on a company called Ecological Tool and Toy, a startup, and they had a patent actually on the very first responsive active architectural material called soft control material. But the work they were doing was very divergent from what was going on back on MIT's campus. The work they were doing was, I'm going to show a video on the left-hand side here, a little bit more about how can we create spaces that really help bring us in touch with our immediate environment, that speak to our humanity and that connect people to one another through that environment. They were working at a quarry in New Hampshire that Avery Johnson owned. His family owned it, and there was a lake there, and there were forests there, and they were doing things outside, and they were messing around with materials, and they were building stuff, and they were doing these explorations. Here's another bit of footage from that time when they're talking about technology and the evolution of switches from big switches that are in your house to little smaller switches and typewriter keys. And they're just talking about how the technology is the same. It just keeps changing size and getting miniature.
And this kind of development is not adequate for people to be able to reach into the technology.
It has changed shape, but it hasn't changed function at all. It hasn't changed itself. It's just on and off, on and off.
This kind of a switch where you have something that's moving, if you put your hand on this.
This is the kind of switch that interests us. reacts back on you.
So their interest was really in making things that were mutual and natural and part of the environment they were in, not just the hard shell of technology. So in doing this work, they were essentially building a quite radical community of people who were doing their own thing. They were essentially hippies and self-described as such, and started writing more and more screed-like papers about the divergence of where technology was going and where this arrow of technology had taken. He says, we know we must leave the old space science technocracy, the world of universals and universities. Soft control material research is our alternative to doing nothing while we climb out of the Mechamax death trap. So the other thing we're seeing here is this tiny period of time, these 3 years between 1969 and 1972, what was happening? What was happening was over at the Media Lab, we had this kind of hard shell research on how technology could create these spaces, and this very, very well funded by the military. MIT, 50% of their funding at that time was by the military. And this demo that I'm sure everybody here is very aware of, the spatial data management system, and put that there. These demos that were really about command and control. They were really about asserting command over one's environment through interface. Whereas Brodie Johnson were increasingly anti-war, anti-military industrial complex. The polarization of American society around the Vietnam War at that time was intense, and it suddenly, became much more clear why Negroponte not only felt that he had to, but really needed to put distance between himself and this other community of researchers who so inspired him in his early trajectory. So that was really fascinating to me, how different ideologies about technology and what technology can be can so diverge, and then how one can win out over the other based on exposure. Because I think Brodie's story and Brodie's interest and his early papers really have not been seen by very many people, and they're not really in common circulation right now. Now, moving from there, we also see how that thread of technology continues. So ArcMac and Negroponte quickly shifted from architecture, and in fact gave up on architecture altogether as their MO, as they ended up really creating what we now see as the tools of interface with computers. So many of those graphical user interfaces, so many of those early touchscreens are now really directly mapped onto how architecture and technology are connected today. So rather than thinking about technology as a part of the building infrastructure, we think about technology mostly in architecture as ways to design buildings. We don't think of them as ways to live within the systems of architecture the way Pask did, or the way any of those early Archigram. A lot of that has now been lost through that vector of the ArcMac becoming MIT Media Lab, and the ability and the communication ability of Negroponte's vision, which was extraordinary and incredibly influential over the next several decades. So we do find technology within architecture, but what we find is that it's really very practical and pragmatic. We find motion detectors and security alarms and remote controls and access control and that sort of thing. And we find very little expressive, kinetic, active objects driven by technology in today's architecture. So I found this really fascinating. I did get an opportunity to speak with Warren Brodie. He turned 100 a few months ago. He's living in Norway. He's still quite cogent. We had a wonderful call. We talked about that history. We talked about what was going on. And he really helped sort of connect the dots for me. The other person I talked to around the same time was Evgeny Morozov. And Evgeny Morozov, some of you may know him. He was a big time sort of technology, or critic of big tech, let's say. And while everyone was boosting big tech in the 1990s and in the 2000s and talking about social media and the new economy, Evgeny Morozov wrote a couple of books, The Net Delusion and To Save Everything, Click Here, which both started asking a lot of questions and saying, yeah, it's all great, but what about? And it turns out, when I started looking deeper into Brodie, Evgeny Morozov wrote his PhD dissertation on Warren Brodie and has actually done a biography of him. So he just got his PhD from Harvard after being a writer for decades and also being quite an adversary of Negroponte. They had a couple of very strong battles, actually. So Morozov has been researching Warren Brody and has been connected to this story for a while. But the thing is, his PhD thesis was embargoed, so I couldn't actually read it, and I didn't understand why it was embargoed until this time next year. So I called him, we got in touch, and we talked a bit about it. And it turns out it's because he's writing a book about it. And actually, the story of Warren Brody is coming back and being told. It turned into, instead of a book, he actually ended up creating a podcast. And I'm announcing this now, but we should all know the podcast is actually launching on Saturday. It's coming out this week. It's called A Sense of Rebellion. And if you want to follow this story a lot more closely, he has some incredible archival tape and footage, and it's been 10 years of research he's put together into this podcast series. So I'm super looking forward to it. I'll leave the story of Warren Brody right there, but I think this idea will resonate and come back as we start talking about the other bits and pieces of the journey. So senseofrebellion.com, check it out. And actually, Warren Brody also has his archive is in Vienna, at the same place as the past archive, in fact. And he now has there's a show up right now in Norway about his life and his work. So there are a number of ways in which this is coming back, having been sort of maybe lost or forgotten or minimized over the past 30, 40 years. People are starting to see value in it, starting to see what babies were thrown out with the bathwater, perhaps, and we'll find out. So within this whole story, of course, I want to talk a little bit about my own journey, and I sort of intersect with this. It was wonderful to see this history as I was doing the research, but I intersect with this around 1992 when I ended up at the MIT Media Lab, and I spent my undergrad mostly there, but then also did my master's with Professor Ishii. Thank you so much, Hiroshi. And then after the MIT Media Lab, went to Xerox PARC, where I spent a couple of years there. So that period for me was incredibly formative in thinking again about how can we combine this technology and the poetics of it together. When I was at the Tangible Media Group, one of the projects we did was the ambient room, and it was a demo. It was a bit of a proof of concept. It was an exploration, but what we did was we were able to take information and move it into our environment through natural soundscapes and clocks and light and airflow. And I'm sure everybody in this room knows the project really well. But for me, it was really quite a turning point. It really made me start thinking about the built environment and the physical objects around us. So from an architectural perspective, it lit a fire for me about expressive poetics. After I finished at the Media Lab and I went to Xerox PARC, I was hired by Mark Weiser. Everybody here knows who Mark Weiser is, father of ubiquitous computing, also wrote about technology. And when I went to work at PARC, I was working with Rich Gold. Rich was a polymath, an artist, a provocateur, a philosopher, and he ran an interdisciplinary group at Xerox PARC that was really looking deeply again into how technology could be integrated in really humanistic ways with our lives, and how we could create tools, and what are the sort of effects of technology, asking the deeper questions and hoping to provoke people to really think a little bit deeper about what it is they're making. In the context of architecture, in 1995, Rich wrote a really beautiful piece called "How Smart Does Your Bed Have to Be Before You're Afraid to Go to Sleep at Night," which has been just prescient in so many ways and incredibly compelling. It's a series of questions that goes on for page after page after page, and it just really makes you think about the systems and the details. Rich was a poet and an incredible mentor to me. So in that time, we were kind of asking a lot of these questions. Unfortunately, both Rich and Mark died very young, and a lot of their story has also not really been told in the subsequent generation. It was a little bit before social media and LinkedIn, and everybody had a video of everything, and you kind of had to go looking for it. Fortunately, this year, a few things are starting to bubble up again with a bit more of an echo of this, lost older research, I would say. One is John Tennell's recent book, The Philosopher of Palo Alto, about Mark Weiser, which is a really great read, and I recommend it to everyone on the call. Really beautiful. And it was as I was reading that I really started to see a lot of echoes with the Brody situation in the way Mark was thinking more holistically about ubiquitous computing and these actual battles that were going on between Mark Weiser and Negroponte and the agents approach versus the ubiquitous computing approach. Very interesting stuff kind of bubbling through here. And then the other piece of it was meeting Amber Case. Amber Case is funny. She discovered this long lost 1996 article about com technology by The Coming World of Com Technology by Mark Weiser and John Seeley Brown, and it changed her life. She is an advisor to a lot of sort of Silicon Valley startups and technology people, and she's a public speaker, and she's given a beautiful TED Talk about this and written a book called Com Technology, recapturing and reframing the principles of com technology for the current generation. And actually last week, so again, this is very topical, just last week, Amber announced the public launch of the Com Technology Institute, the ComTech Institute. And I'll be a board advisor on the ComTech Institute. We've been having a lot of conversation about it, but essentially the ComTech Institute aims to be a body that helps technology companies and industry with the design of their products to just see to what degree they are considering and thinking and screening, will there be a com technology aspect of this? Are they adhering to com technology principles? And can they be certified as com technology products? So some of this thinking is actually percolating, and I'm feeling like right now in this moment is a really nice time for a lot of this to come back to the fore. And I'm very excited for the next little while to come back from this. My own personal journey with this idea of com technology or technology used in humanistic ways, after I left Xerox PARC, my partner and spouse, Susan, and my creative partner has been, we've been working together to create experiences using technology for people in the real world, technology-driven experiences. So this is a table that we created that asks that question about, should the technology that's embedded in our environment be more pragmatic and practical, or should it be expressive? So things like this were a part of 20 years of our art and technology explorations, where we're trying to take technology in slightly different directions than it was perhaps intended to, maybe to bring back some of these questions about how can we put more humanity into our technology and our technological interfaces. So why am I telling you all this? Why are we here? Really, I think the thing about it, and the reason to preface all of what I've been doing but with all of this, is I think right now we are at a bit of an inflection point. We're at an inflection point in material science and in technology development, where a lot of what was being talked about in the 1960s, the materials that can change shape, can change color, can change texture around us, are being developed. The labs are starting to create this stuff. The miniaturization and the machines that can produce, this is a paper that was just published a few months ago by MIT, where it's a 3D printed object that has within it air pockets and pneumatics. So with one machine, you can now produce moving objects that can come to life, that can basically be animated in your space. We've got nano manufacturing at tiny scales. We have embedded computation. So on the left-hand side, next to on this person's fingertip, next to a grain of salt, that is the EEPROM memory storage from an Apple iPhone. And you can hardly see it, it's so small. And then on the tip of a syringe, what we see there is work coming out of Columbia University that is an injectable sensor plus Wi-Fi, or plus communication plus power, all in one package. So we're seeing incredible developments. I won't say necessarily progress, but developments towards this coming future of active objects in our built environment. And so the question starts to become, once these things start being used by designers, start being accessible to designers and to the people who are creating the spaces we're living in, what is that going to look like? We're already seeing some commercial products like this Nanoleaf Elements home decor that is built from active objects that can be programmed and that can respond and that can create ambiance in your space. The tip of the iceberg, we're starting to see what can happen when objects start to come alive, essentially. But the one question that persists for me is, how will we design with this? How will we control this? How will we even consider what it should do once it can do? So there was a really nice speculative work done by Sarah Nabil and David Kirk a couple of years ago at the TEI conference. They created an IKEA catalog, a forward-looking IKEA catalog, scenario planning based on a whole bunch of prototypes that they had created. Moving vases and active rugs and ottomans that change shape and this kind of stuff. And putting it together in the IKEA catalog, they asked some very important questions. Decoraction was the name of the project. But the questions they asked included, What about issues of control? And how do they communicate together? And how does this all work? What's the techless network, or what is the network that underlies all of these devices? I mean, now we have industrial designers, roboticists, and people making incredible demonstrations, architects, people making incredible demonstrations in their schools' labs. But how does this move into the real world? And when it does, how do we even think about educating a whole generation of people to work with these materials that are active and live? Which brings me to part two. So all of that was preamble for part two, where we talk about the spatialized digital milieu. So the thing about the spatialized digital milieu is it's a response, given everything we've been talking about, to the idea that today, IoT and active devices and active objects in our environment are very task-oriented. It's command and control. You tell it to do something and it does it. Alexa, raise the blinds. Alexa, play my music. Whereas the spatialized digital milieu takes an entirely different approach. It sort of flips that around. And instead, what we have is a space, and within that space, we have a coordinate space. We have an overlaid milieu, an overlaid volume of data. And that volume of data can influence the objects that are within this space. It's based on the ideas of influence and attunement. Each of the objects can attune themselves to the influences, the data that is spatially distributed within the spaces that they're in. Each of the objects are hybrid physical digital objects, and they can listen to and respond to these virtual signals that are present within their space. It's a little bit like if you think about a volume of salt water and a coral reef. Within that coral reef, there's all these creatures, and different creatures will be attuned to different things, to the amount of oxygen or the temperature or the pressure or the currents that are going through that space. And if we can imagine that in a digital virtual space, so we have currents we can create algorithmically, and then we have physical objects that have the digital capability to attune to these messages or to this changing datascape that surrounds them, this digital milieu. Within the space, you can have different influences, and those influences are layered on top of each other. It's actually an infinite number. You can just have them all running in parallel, and different objects will be attuned differently to these different influences. Some of the objects may not be attuned to anything, and they act like normal everyday objects. Some of them may be attuned to multiple influences within this space. If we start thinking about it this way, we start to see that there can be a milieu that influences the action of the objects rather than telling every object what to do at all times. It's a little bit like a breeze blowing through the grassland. The concept of milieu is something that's been in philosophy for years. It's been in biology. Georges Canguilhem was a biologist before he became a philosopher, and he wrote a great paper that was only recently translated called The Living and Its Milieu. And it's in reading this that I just chose to use the word milieu to describe what I'm talking about. It's been used in a lot of other contexts, like a social milieu or just a context. But really, in the way Georges Canguilhem is talking about it here, he traces how it's been used in science and all the different ways that word applies. And my meaning of it is really much more about than the biology. It's much more like the biological meaning of milieu. One of the important things about milieu in biology is that there may be one milieu objectively, but to each organism within that milieu, we create our own view, we create our own milieu. He says, living things draw their own specific and singular milieu, also called Umwelt, if you follow the German philosophers. So this idea of Umwelt is all about taking a space, creating influences in that space, and then designing our objects so that they are attuned and attentive to the movement and the changes within that space, or not, depending on what we want them to do and how we want them to behave. This Ned Kahn sculpture captures it quite beautifully. It's the wind that blows through, and one could say that he designed these tiny little objects to be very well attuned to the wind, whereas other objects in that same space may not be attuned to wind at all. So in translating this digitally to the kind of work that I've been doing, what we think of it as is a digital wind that blows through the space, or digital flow that can move through the space affecting certain objects. So in this diagram, what you're seeing on the right-hand side is an underlying control system that's powering an installation that's happening that you can see the structure of on the left-hand side. And when you see it in person, you can see this is the way it appears, and some of the objects within this space are attuned to those signals that are traversing through that space. As we change the parameters of that visualization, you have different activity within the space. Another example of using this technique of influence engines, which is what we call them, the algorithms that are running the influences. This one is called exciters, and what it is it creates a whole bunch of virtual spheres that move through the virtual space of a physical installation. And as they move through, they affect that installation and they bring it to life. But it's really all based on physics and around how the orbitals of these spheres are designed and programmed, and then the parameters of how strong is the gravity and how fast are they moving, all this kind of stuff. The one that we saw before, which looked more like the wind or the weather patterns moving through, is really just very, very simple algorithm based on the Perlin noise or simplex noise to create a 3D volume of noise. And then depending on how you look at that volume of noise, you're essentially being able to create at different scales and different speeds these wind patterns that move through the space. So with the important part here is that with one algorithm and then maybe 3 or 4 parameters that can vary, you can get extraordinarily complex and layered and coordinated behavior out of a multitude of objects without actually ever sending any of them a single command. Another way to think about it is if you have an architectural scale installation of physical objects that can all do things, and you've got thousands of them, you should try to be the wind, not the leaves. This, of course, has implications for scalability, right? If we're going to make buildings, if we're going to make facades, if we're going to make environments that people are going to live in and move through and work in, they're going to have a lot of components. So one of the things that we did with these influence engines in some of the more recent work we've done is we took that same idea of the Perlin noise or the noise system, but instead of running it on a central computer and then telling all of these different devices how to operate, what we did is we embedded that same code, that same algorithm in every one of the 40 little microcontrollers that are running this installation. And by doing that, what we were able to do is we were able to have a situation where people could interact with the installation and it would respond, but there is no control system actually going on here. What's happening is there are sensors, and when something is sensed, everybody hears that somebody touched something. Everybody knows where they touched, and they do what they need to do because they can run the algorithm to calculate, oh, was that close to me? Is that far from me? How fast is it moving? When will it hit me? So if 40 different processors are dealing with just a tiny little bit of information, what you can end up with from a human perspective when you're in that space is this feeling that the whole space is alive. It's a lot more like an ecosystem, perhaps like flocking birds, like the murmurations of birds, where you see a huge organism, but it's really made by tiny little decisions being made by each individual independent organism. The other implication of taking this approach is that the behavior design tools and the visualization tools all sit one level up from the control system. The control system is happening in the network. All of the distributed pieces are doing their own thing. And signals are being sent across the network that everybody can listen to and hear and respond to in order to do that thing. So now we have the opportunity to produce different kinds of tools, different kinds of interfaces, different kinds of visualization that all look at the same system at the same time, that can tap into these layered influence levels and make them appropriate for whoever's going to use them, which means suddenly we have the ability for musicians or school groups or artists or people with no technical experience to maybe have an interface that works a lot better for them into the same system, rather than imposing upon them, here's the system and here's how you interact with it. So just to clarify one more time exactly how this is working. In a room with a whole bunch of physical digital objects, each one of them will know about the influence engines that are acting in that room. Each one of them within its code will have behavior logic of how it responds, and it knows its own coordinates in X, Y, Z, and in time. So when there's a specific point of interest in that space, so for example, where my actuators sit, are they being influenced by something? Then it can use the influence engine and the parameters that are being fed to the influence engine. So those parameters might come from sensors, or they might come from a script, or they might come from a motion control or motion capture system or connect cameras in the room. We don't know. It can come from any kinds of things to perturb those algorithms that are changing what's going on in that space. And it's when running that influence engine algorithm on those specific inputs creates the output that triggers behavior logic in the space, and you get action within the environment. So this is in contrast to me saying, Alexa, play the music. It's the agency situated within the object being able to take advantage of this to decide, oh, I think music should be played right now. And I'm talking about music, but we can also talk about other kinds of behavior logic. And this is where it gets really exciting to me, because all of this is thought of as a low-level infrastructure on which we can now build. So behavior logic could have extraordinarily complex AI involved, or it could just light up a light. It doesn't matter in this system. I mean, people can hopefully extend the system to do more and more complex, more and more layered things. In the same way that we see here, so many influences all present in the same place, and the behavior logic is different for each organism in this video. In our studio, we have built some simple tools for exploring this and for trying to understand the complexity. So for example, this is a tool that lets you just drop a whole bunch of actuators into a space and see what happens, give them a little bit of behavior and see how they influence each other and how you can create complex responses from that. Another example of that same tool in use here is prototyping the behavior logic for some objects that were going to be part of an installation. And so you see that happening on the right-hand side, and then Ryan here is going to demonstrate what happens when we put it into the physical objects. So it's the same logic applied to actual physical object. And then if we upload this behavior logic into all sorts of objects and we put them in the right places in the space and they know where they are, then at the right time, they'll act in that way. And this is, again, these are just almost proof of concept for how we can separate out the behavior logic from the influences which trigger it. So implications of designing this way. You know, you create these systems. I'm very inspired by Keller Easterling, who also writes a little bit, actually I have her book here, it's called Medium Design, beautiful thin book. She writes really poetically about the design of the medium and design in the medium. I talk about the milieu, she talks about the medium. But she says designers are usually very good at making things with shapes and outlines, but design in the medium is less like making a thing, more like having your hands on the faders and toggles of organization. It's the systems, it's the interconnections, it's the relationships. She says it is the design of interdependencies, of chemistries, of chain reactions. And this thinking, you can see the echoes of the sorts of things that Brody was talking about. And this thinking has kind of been woven through the way I'm thinking about this poetic application of technology and how can we change the technological vector that we're on. I wrote a few different pieces about this in the dissertation that I published. Gardens versus gears is one way to think about it. Rather than gearing up a factory to produce a known thing, planting seeds in a garden and then tending and cultivating is more like the design of this kind of intersection within the spatialized digital milieu. And similarly, rather than puppets where we want the thing to do exactly what we said it would do, if you look at these demonstrations right now of humanoid robots, you get this puppeting thing where somebody teaches it how to do a thing and it does it back again. But I think of this kind of design implication as more like pets, where it has agency, it's going to do the thing, and you can train it and you can guide it and you can help it, but the pet is going to do its thing. And at the end of the day, you know, why do we have pets? What is the purpose of a house pet, right? We want that. We want that in our lives. We want that mutuality and that empathy from our environments in the same way. Finally, the other design implication that I speak about a little bit is this idea of identity versus instance. So a lot of the time when people do physical design, they think about the object as the final product. They think about, so I'm going to hold this thing up. They think about this kind of thing, this kind of sculptural element, and how does it get designed? How does it get fabricated? But a lot of what I'm doing here with this identity versus instance, it actually comes from way back. Hiroshi, you might remember this when we were doing the Triangles project and thinking about objects that have a hybrid physical and digital identity. It has a physical identity, but it also has a digital identity that we just can't necessarily always see. So if you see the video that's happening on the left-hand side, we have a small sculpture, and this is a proof of concept. When we shine a projector on this sculpture, The spatialized digital milieu contains not just the data points, but it also contains other virtual objects, objects that have an identity but don't necessarily have the same physicality to them, or they have different physicality to them. And those objects are encoded in the design of each and every object. So when we think about the design of these objects, we can design the physical piece and we can design the virtual piece or the digital piece. And we can balance them and give them both primacy rather than saying, oh, it's a physical thing that is augmented. And thinking about the design this way makes a lot of the congruence that's happening right now with spatial computing and headsets and VR and AR, and in this case, augmented shadows, it makes it come through in a much more flexible and layered way. Rather than designing the demo, what we're doing is designing the substrate. And as soon as we put all these pieces together, the action just happens. We don't have to think carefully. We don't have to think as carefully about every single aspect. And then again, command and control every single puppet in that interaction. So I've been showing you a bunch of the work that I've been involved with over the past few years and some of the explorations that have led to this work with the spatialized digital milieu. I have to put it in context and say, you know, this past 5 years, I've been working very closely with Philip Beasley and the Living Architecture Systems Group. So a lot of the imagery you see and all of the form language you see is very deeply informed by Philip. In short, the Living Architecture Systems Group is a large and amorphous global research organization that is full of interesting people who are doing things with you know, everything from computer science to neuroscientists to musicians who have come together to ask these questions or explore these ideas. Can architecture integrate living functions? Can it be more empathetic? And can we create an enhanced human experience with architecture, asking a lot of these same questions that may resonate from those 1960s imaginings? Philip often shows sketches like this. This is one of his sketches that is really asking this question. Do we need architecture to be closed walls? Do we need to be enclosed and bounded? Do we have to have boundaries between us, both physical ones, but also political ones, and also all of the other ones that separate some humans from others? Do we need those boundaries, or can architecture help to break them down? Can we create porosity? Can we create exchange? Can we create mutuality in our built environments? And the work practice of the Living Architecture Systems Group has been to create these immersive, essentially immersive sculptures that you can be within, and then to deploy them, and to deploy them around the world in lots of places where actual people will actually be. So physical lobbies of buildings or museums or places of coming together, and not just as to make a point by putting the sculpture there, but actually as a test bed, as a place where we can try these things out, where we can develop this software further, where we can develop these interactions further, where we can develop the materials more completely, and we can really watch and understand how what it takes to make architectural scale technologically based interventions, right? What does it mean to bring this kind of HCI stuff into something at the scale of architecture? So deploying to the public is really very important to the work practice that we have. It's through making these deep technological infrastructures that power these sculptures that I have kind of come to these notions of the spatialized digital milieu, and also the application of the spatialized digital milieu, the implementation. And through that, there's 6 qualities that have come up, that have become come to the fore as necessary qualities of a technology infrastructure in an architectural context. Necessary in that, in order to build things at an architectural scale and with longevity, you're going to need to do these things, for better or for worse. They fall into 2 different categories. One is supporting real-world architectural integration. And to do that, you need your system to be persistent and resilient. It has to be something that can survive, right? And a lot of the technology we use is demos. People make a thing, they show the video. But if you're really going to be serious about deploying something, it has to be architected at a software level in such a way that it can be persistent. Spatial coordination, I've already talked a lot about, and scalability as well. If you're thinking along the lines of hundreds of thousands of processors somewhere, then you really need to think differently about the way you architect your system. On the other side is the realization and the understanding that it needs to enable collaboration and adoption. By like deep baked into the nature of this work, we need other people to take it on. We need other people to play with it. We need other people to do more stuff with it. We need other people to embrace the ideology and to extend it and to take it further. you can't live in a little lab bubble. And I think a lot of the really exciting things that have been shown in videos and demos over the past couple of decades in this world have also ended up suffering from the idea that they're not accessible, they're not open, and they're not available for people. So in order to do that, three principles: extensibility, interoperability, and the availability of tools. So extensibility, I've already talked about in terms of this idea of layered influence engines. It doesn't matter if you don't respond, if your object doesn't respond to a certain influence engine, it just won't respond. So it's okay to have persistent influence engines that are all running together, and some objects are newer and some objects are older, and you've extended it and added a new influence engine. So by design, we want it extensible. Interoperability, this image here is actually one of our colleagues who works with us at TU Delft. And he's showing something really interesting, which is that his students ended up, within the context of a spatialized digital milieu installation that we had created, his students ended up using different hardware, different software, and different mechanisms to produce activity based on the influence engines that were in that space. So they didn't use any of the same hardware, software, code, or designs that we had made, yet they were able to use this underlying enabling infrastructure. And that's key, I think, this interoperability, so you don't end up with walled gardens and races for who's going to be on top. Finally, availability of tools, particularly to non-technical creators. Here, this is actually something that really makes me happy and really drives me about this, which is this idea that we can create a system, and then people who come from different backgrounds, who aren't necessarily technologists, who don't necessarily know how to use a command line shell, can come along and they can use whatever tools are familiar to them. So it's possible within this spatialized digital milieu, because the operation of it sits at a lower level, and all you need to be able to do is send very simple commands or signals to change those very simple parameters, for example, for the wind or for the touch points. These tools can take a lot of different shapes. So it's enabled us to do some really fun and interesting and very quick collaborations. For example, in this case, on the right-hand side, Mike Winters, who was at Indiana University, in a weekend, was able to take a headset, a brain capturing headset for BCI, and connect it just directly to our system that was already running. And this person was able to attach map the brain waves to the parameters of our influence engines, and suddenly the whole room was responding directly to what she was doing. And he had never used the system before, and he didn't need to know how the system actually worked. He just needed to know that you attach this parameter to this parameter, and there you go. Similarly, we had a workshop with Biopack, who is doing really innovative medical devices and also biometric sensing devices. And this woman's heartbeat was being sensed and conveyed into the room. And this took about 45 minutes to set up from the moment they walked in, and they had never seen the system before. And we used Max MSP, which was an interface they were familiar with. And so that was easy enough to hook into and to take the heartbeats and to then spatialize them in the room. And a fun thing that's maybe not so obvious about this, what's pretty cool though, is like in our research group and in our studio, when we're working with these things, because the milieu is pervasive, we have these weird situations where we'll do something like this heartbeat demo, but meanwhile, over on the other side of the room, there's something else hanging on the wall that happens to be attuned to the same characteristics. And suddenly it'll start doing something. And we had no intention or hadn't really thought that it would happen. But again, because it's all part and parcel of the real world, just like physics, these things show up. And so you end up with creative collisions in really interesting ways. This was last March, and Hiroshi, you'll probably recognize these pictures. We were at the MIT Media Lab and looking at a research collaboration with some of the students there. Jack Foreman, who is one of the PhD students who's working on new materials that are active and that can morph and change under. So we were looking at antagonistic structures and how they might support these new materials. So we took Jack's fibers, and by using them along with some of our own constructions, we were able to very quickly actuate this robotic arm. And this was very, very early work. Since then, his work has progressed much more, and there's a lot of really amazing stuff. They just published in some really nice publications last year, and it's now a lot more public than it was at that time, the fiber robo work. So that kind of collaboration, and especially in educational settings, is something that we're looking to do more of, and something that we like to do, which is to go somewhere and do workshops and help kind of people see the potentials of this kind of interaction with technology versus the rest of the way that people usually do their robotics. This was at TU Delft in the interactive environments minor. And then the next year we went back and did the same, a similar workshop, but in this case we were actually building an environment, and the students deployed many different robotic explorations using this system. And very quickly, within a week, we had them all, they were all coordinated and reflective of very interesting concepts that each of the students were coming up with. And we actually published a paper about that at the ACM HRI, Human Robot Interaction Conference in Boulder in March. So if you want to read more about that project, that's there. The last example I'll show was how, we collaborate with academia, we collaborate with researchers, but also the opportunity to involve artists and residents and work with artists. In this case, one of our installations is a permanent installation in a large gathering space, and it has a 48-channel sound system that is designed for spatialized sound. So working with people from, with Paul Holleman from a group called 40 Sound that produces a spatialized sound engine, we were able to have Ado van Bremen, who's a composer, does a lot of work for shows, TV shows and movies. He created an installation, or I'm sorry, a performance, and he orchestrated a performance of our interactive environment, or of our immersive environment, and all of the visual and behavioral aspects of that performance were created using influence engines, triggered influence engines. And I'll show you just a 5-second clip of that. So 5,000 actuators, or in that ballpark, all actuated in conjunction with the music by varying the way the influence engines were working throughout the 18-minute performance, and were being the wind and not the leaves in that case. For those of you who are in Toronto, Meander is in Cambridge, Ontario, not too far from here, and they're doing showings of that performance, I think, on Wednesdays throughout the summer. So it's worth checking out on their website. You can, and it's free. You can just go and check it out if you want to see it. So yeah, the spatialized digital milieu, one of the things that's really exciting to me about it is that now that we've got this kind of ideological framework and this idea for the infrastructure level of how to control objects within an environment, there's a lot of different ways this could be taken in terms of research. And so across a whole spectrum, from the deeply technical of how do we share data and how do we encode these algorithms so that they're easy to deploy across different platforms in real time, to tools and applications like what happens when you put on a VR headset in a spatialized digital milieu, what more can you see and how does that interface? A lot of HCI questions about what does it mean and how do you know that you're in this space, and how do you empathetically interact with this space? Huge questions about the changing role of design and design workflow, and how do things like material science innovations become the raw material for new spatialized digital milieu experiences? And then societal questions. I mean, what are the privacy implications? What are the implications of authorship in a space like this, where many influences are already present? They've been made by different people, and now you're bringing new objects into them. Who owns that, and how should they own that? Those kinds of questions, and cultural and anthropological research based on this and where it might go. Even just these questions that we've had about the vector of technology and why are we doing what we're doing right now? Why are we making devices, and could we instead be making more experiences? So I hope that this has been a contribution in talking a little bit about the 6 qualities, the framework itself, influence versus attunement, or influence and attunement and how they come together, some reframing of ideas of design within the spatialized digital milieu, and maybe the grounding in the historical narrative also helps set the stage for perhaps some thinking that might have been lost otherwise, and that we can revive and maybe bring together with where we sit today in terms of our technological development. So thank you very much for your attention.
Really
Fabulous.
inspiring talk, Matt.
Thank you. Wow. And what have you been in your spare time? Fabulous. I have a picture to share with my class in that installation from the Futurium in 2019.
Computarium in Berlin. Yeah,
Yes.
Ilona's been one of our biggest fans. She's taken her students to Futurium every year to go and engage with the noosphere, which was there until very recently, was just recently taken down to make way for the next exhibit. But
So able to see it twice in 5-year intervals. So I think pretty cool.
I'll stop my screen share now and happy to engage in questions or clarifications or any other conversation that people feel compelled to send my way, including in the chat if anyone wants to. I just realized we have a chat.
Can I ask questions, Matt?
Please.
Yeah, first of all, it's super impressive because conceptual framework is something most important to guide the people to the centuries directions. So that I think taxonomy conceptual framework, which backed up by all the pioneer, especially Nicolas Negropontes, he did amazing stuff. But also I didn't know that so many people who disagree, compete against him. So those are very rich intellectual background that we have to learn. Even I teach UbiComp in MIT, all the students don't know Mark Weiser. They never read original one. So I think historically it's very powerful. And second, the design of the architecture is quite impressive. And especially last like a piece, it's very, very sophisticated, complex. And but my question is, complexity is always give amazing impressions. Then I'm sure that many people can participate in this digital physical forest, do a lot of stuff. Then a lot of things happens. So one thing around the causality chain, if you speak, you want to see the impact, influence of your voice to other people's. But in a forest, if wind blow, everybody scream, nobody can distinguish which is me. So I think a SIGGRAPH often people does like a collaborative art performance, but the key is how each individual or group can know we are contributing. So how to bring an incentive of legibility of me or group to make a constructive collaboration in such a sophisticated, complex environment in which nobody can infer causality chain?
That is a beautiful question, Hiroshi. Thank you for asking it. And I love that you go straight to the heart of the issue of complexity in HCI. We no longer have a mouse and a button and you push the button and you get feedback. Like now we have every degree of freedom you could imagine. And not only that, I think to just take it even one step further, we have objects that we can't even imagine today that will be made by someone in the future that could exist within this environment. So how can I, as the designer of the environmental substrate, imagine this collaboration with the future? How can I imagine this collaboration with somebody who has access perhaps to technologies that haven't even been invented now and plan for that? And I think the only answer I can give, I mean, I'll give a two-part answer, but the first answer I can give to that is that when I think of this, I really think of it as infrastructure. I think what we're doing here is not the design of the final interaction in any particular way. We're absolutely doing that for these experiences, for these artworks. We are creating something that we want people to experience, and we're playing, we're experimenting, we're seeing what works and doesn't. And I think of it as very early days, very tip of the iceberg even. People enjoy these environments and they respond to these environments. But when I think about the spatialized digital milieu as infrastructure, what I actually like to think is that it is simply a supporting infrastructure. And designing within that infrastructure could have this aesthetic, and it could have this form language, or it could have a vastly different form language created by vastly different designers and look really different, but still use the same infrastructure. In that way, I think of it as a bit of a blank canvas, and people can do really bad designs, or they can do really amazing designs. In a sense, I think this is an opening. I hope this is an opening to a broad new way of making this idea of interactive spaces approachable. And the question you asked is one of the big research questions that HCI might be grappling with here. What are the new ways of managing people's attention, focus, response, and understanding of what they're doing within such a system. I think until now, it's been very, very hard to research that kind of thing, because in order to even get to the point where you're asking the question, you have to build the system, and you have to spend the years and the time, and you have to write the code, and you have to get the industrial design, and you have to, I mean, there's so much to do that. And the people who can do it are a very narrow subset of society. It's the people who have the training across disciplines and the technological expertise to execute. That's been my experience. So we only see the voices of a very, very few in the design of these kinds of new spaces and new ways of interacting. And I hope that by creating an infrastructure now, we'll get many, many more voices who can play more easily with easier tools and maybe answer the questions you're asking a little quicker. I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for you, but that's my perspective.
I think you've done half of PhD. You got a PhD, but you got the infrastructure. But you know, internet, social media, it's a mess. Originally, people have very optimistic view. So you need a higher level of architecture to bring people more meaning and controls. So infrastructure can be white sheet of paper. You can do any drawing, mess or beautiful one. So let me give an example. If I interact with the flower, it's nice. Also, this influence the next flower, tree, the forest. But you know, system dynamics. World is very complex. Population double, then scarcity of foods, pollution increase. Then you have a decision. Do you stop the giving more birth or energy consumption? Everything is a causality chain. So Jay Forrester invented a system dynamics new model, higher level architecture on top of the infrastructure of the computing. So I think you are half done, but another next maybe second PhD would be how to help people come up more not the goal oriented, but at least purposeful tools to think with. So nonlinear simulation or system dynamics very powerful because all of a sudden catastrophic change happens. So I think of this is beautiful, but also natural environment is so complex. So hope you can decrease the entropy, bring some higher level architecture on top of your infrastructure. That's my hope.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's fabulous. And I hope to find partners who will work with me on that kind of work. Sure. Because there's such great expertise in the world to do that if we can bootstrap one another, that's exactly the kind of way we can move forward faster. Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question, but would love to let others jump in first.
Please go.
Okay, I have two questions, and I'll leave the 1970s, 1930s, and 2020s question for later, Matt. But I'm seeing what you showed today and what we were discussing with protocols yesterday on John Underkoffler's Discord server in a new way, and it makes me think a little bit about 2017, 2018 kerfuffle where iRobot's CEO was indicating he wanted to sell Wi-Fi maps of your home as one of the major monetizations of the iRobot. And so with what you were showing in your videos, that could be happening entirely in the Facebook cloud and the Amazon cloud, or entirely within your room and never leaving the room. And 99.9% of users might never know the difference. And I have a feeling that it does matter to you whether that happens in the Facebook cloud versus in your own ecology. And I'm just sort of a little bit curious, and it's relating to Hiroshi's question. As you contemplate this in the next weeks, months, years, and decades, do you have a vision for how someone would know the difference, control the difference, be aware if suddenly they moved from an entirely local space to bringing one object into their world that changed that dynamic very much? Thoughts?
Yeah. Fantastic question. Absolutely. And again, yes, I mean, one of the models that I have looked at as being incredibly successful as infrastructure that can create things we never would have dreamed of is, in fact, the architecture of the internet, and this idea that there are some protocols underlying, but we don't care what devices are on it. We don't care, you know, as long as they follow the rules of the technical rules, they end up being able to get on the web or get on the net, right? And as Hiroshi says, it's a mess. We've seen what has happened there. And I also have to say, it's incredible. It's beautiful. There are so many other things that have happened because of the internet that are also positive. So we do see terrible, horrible things, and we do see positive things. And I'm hoping that we can learn some of the lessons from the internet. Now, I mean, it's a bit of a platitude to your question, which was really much more pointed than that. So what I would say is that number one, in order for this to work, this being an interoperable, extensible, layered, persistent, spatialized milieu in which people can play, it can't really be wholly owned by Apple in a walled gardens or Facebook or iRobot or whatever. Because what we'll end up with is these competing standards, which we've already had. We've had the competing standards of how are you going to do mesh networking in your house, and is it going to be, threads or matter or whatever, all these different standards, right? But I think there is actually incentive for people to collaborate on the standards for this kind of thing, as long as in collaborating on the standards, they're able to now build that economy where they can participate and they can create their services and they can create their objects. And it's going to be a mess. There are going to be some messy aspects to this kind of deployment. But I think as you ask this question and as this comes up, we are able to start to talk about tokens, and we are able to start talking about access, and we're able to start talking about identity that gets shared, and we're able to start talking about consent and permissions and courteousness in ways at the design stage this early on, that we can start to try to integrate and implement into this stuff. And we're no longer in a place where we have to staple encryption onto all the messaging services. We can design this from the beginning with a certain degree of encryption on top of it. Well, at the same time, understanding that we can infer a lot from what we see in the world. And I don't think that you're ever going to be able to say, I'm making something that is privacy preserving and safe. Instead, I think the approach is actually to say, here is a world, it's like the world, there can be bad actors in it, and there can be malintent in it. And the important thing is, as you say, to be able to recognize that and to be able to know what you're seeing. And to me, part of the idea of the spatialized digital milieu is it takes a lot of invisible signals and it makes them visible through the physical objects in our space. So I imagine that part of the applications that will be created and part of the objects that might find themselves in your space are the ability to see what's going on. I mean, the ability to decode, the ability to look at these objects doing interesting things and then put on the AR overlay to understand exactly who owns what object and where they came from and how are they digitally signed and who bought that and when did they get it and what's the price tag, and anything else, the information that is important to people will be surfaced. Whether or not that will be the economic model and whether or not people will care, as you say, 99% of people may not care. So it remains to be seen, and I look forward to asking those questions and helping push it further.
Thank you so much for that.
Matt, I wonder if I can jump in.
Certainly, please.
So I feel like I'm an outsider here because you're an established community, and I appreciate the work you've done, and thank you for suggesting I come along. I have a problem, though, which is that I'm stuck. And I'm stuck in what I thought Negroponte's idea for architecture machine was, expressed in terms of softness, and all of those influencers are there. But I thought it was about having a conversation with a machine about designing. And I'm disappointed that that's an unfinished revolution. I have a colleague who feels that it's getting closer, not because of the bad ideas that come from generative AI, but for the good potential that may come from them. But it might be useful for me to ask you this question, useful to me certainly, and maybe also to you, which is, you want something from the interactions that you're talking about. And you had one image which was the closest thing to what I would call an interaction model, where you've got the sensors and you've got the stuff over here and et cetera. And I've screenshotted here. It's one of the living architecture research test beds thing. So sensing and actuation under firmware and so on. What this doesn't finish for me, back to Gordon Pask paper in the soft architecture machines, where he's got this cross.
Mhm.
And at the upper level of the cross are the goals, and at the lower level of the cross are the methods to achieve those goals. Have you thought about a model, a diagram that was an expressive, explanatory model of what you want from the consequence of the paired agency between the machines and the people? That's my question.
That's a terrific question. And I don't know if I can do justice to introduce you to the crowd, but I think I should. Paul is the leader, director, president of the American Cybernetic Society.
American Society for Cybernetics. Yeah, it's a nonprofit that's been around a while. Yeah,
it's been around a while. Yeah. In fact, I believe, just to sidebar for just a second, in the upcoming podcast about Brody, there is actually a moment where Brody disrupts the annual meeting of the American Society of Cybernetics as an uninvited guest, stepping up on stage and interrupting the speaker.
Oh, wow, I need to look that up.
There's a photograph. I'll send you the photo. The press kit that was just released with the podcast includes this photo. Anyway, we'll go back to that.
Thank you for that.
Your question is brilliant, and as it can be expected. And so I have a thing about technology that my own personal view of how technology and design for creativity with technology might work has to do in some ways with taking this idea of goal-driven design and trying to set it aside. So I mean, I totally understand where you're coming from, but I'm going to talk a little bit about my approach to thinking about the technology. If we can get away from thinking about what we want, like what's the goal, and you look at, user-centered design and HCI and how successful it's been and the incredible strides that are made when you can interview people and watch them working and understand their goals and then create something for that. But the thing is, when you start with a goal, then you are working with what that person knew they wanted to do, or you're working with what you can infer that person knew they wanted to do. And in the work that I think Brody was trying to do, and in the work that I've been inspired by that Weiser spoke of a little bit, and in the work that I've been inspired by in other places, and maybe what I'm trying to do here is, if I have a goal, it's the goal of creating an open and exploratory space that isn't quite well enough understood to have a goal. And that may be a cop-out, but what I'm talking about is trying to create these interactions or the potentials for interactions that simply put in place a series of potentials and influences and then let some behavior emerge. And I think Pask also had a similar view of that.
Great.
So
let me clarify, and you're taking it in a reasonable direction based on what I have said, but I don't have to have a goal to start. And I don't have to stick with a goal. Goal sounds like this sort of thing that I grab onto and I never let go of. And cybernetics is often misunderstood to be about that, but it's not. And Andy Pickering has a whole book about how the emergence of interaction is what the cybernetic endeavor is about, and et cetera. But I think I can refine my question, and then I'll let you go. Within what you do want, as opposed to what I've mistakenly imposed on you by talking about goals, within the goal of what you do want, you do have some intention there. Maybe goal is the trigger word and intention is better. How do you describe the bounds of agency that you want the participants to have? And what does that model look like? And therefore, what is the capacity that the machinery has to have to enable something else? I'll give you one brief example. I think you're familiar, I don't know if others are, with Pask's Musicolor machine, which was a very, very simple mechanism that led to very profound interactivity. Basically, Musicolor was a machine that gave you a light show if you played an instrument into it, but it had a sense of what you were doing and when you became repetitious by a certain definition. Story for another time. So if you became repetitious, it responded less, which caused you to say, oh, well, wait a minute, it's not interacting, I better do something else. So although its mechanism was simple, it caused you to create novelty on an ongoing basis without end. That was its model.
Yeah.
So
the famous obsolescence circuit. Right?
No, the Albavescence was a different machine.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
The
Yeah.
Albavescence was Eucrates. But anyway,
Okay.
that's my favorite novel of all time. But that's a story for another time, and I don't want to take up too much of this bandwidth. So my question to you is, if you made this thing, this diagram that you have here, I'm still curious about what kinds of interactivity could emerge and where you want it to be able to go. I love Philip Beasley. I love his work. It's staggeringly brilliant, but it only reacts.
Yeah, exactly.
And I want more than that, partly because I'm starting from Pascal and wanting a kind of conversational interface, the way I just described music color and so on.
Yeah. So I'm glad you screenshotted that image, and I don't have it here to put it back up on the screen, but essentially the image you're looking at is an interesting one because it was actually, it preceded the spatialized digital milieu work that I showed today.
I see.
In that, when we were looking at that kind of image, we were thinking along the lines of, if we have all of these sensors, and if we have all these actuators, what's the logic going to be? Exactly your question, what's the logic going to be for this interaction? And there isn't a really easy way to answer that without closing down the creative space and saying, I, as an artist, want this thing to happen. And what we were more interested in doing on the research side of what we were doing is creating a more open substrate that different people who wanted to explore different interactions could come and drop their goals into. And I'll just to go there, though, there was, for example, some really interesting research that happened in one of Philip Beasley's pieces called the curiosity-based learning algorithm at CBLA. There's a paper written about it on machine learning, where the whole idea was that the object did something a little bit like music color in that it looked for something that was unusual in the signals that were coming in from all of its sensors. And when an unusual thing happened, it actuated things in that space. So, and then when it became the same and it became more usual, it would stop. So it would essentially start ignoring you if you kept doing the same thing over and over again, similar to music color, and I think inspired by it in some ways. But I mean, to that point, I think the idea of the spatialized digital milieu approach to the infrastructure is exactly this. It's to create a space in which different people with different philosophies about how this interaction might work can all play.
Right.
And I'm not really working at that level. I'm kind of working at the level below, but I'm hoping to collaborate with people who have
the level below or the level above.
Well,
sounds to me like the level above where you're trying
overarching level above,
I guess,
to create the infrastructure.
First of all, thank you for the work. It's beautiful work, and I love the way you're going, and I even love the openness of it. But I suppose I'm perhaps different than you. I'm interested in the instances, which then have agency, as I keep on saying, for
I can't wait.
The participants.
I honestly can't wait for more people who are really excited about the specifics of how an interaction could now play out with this to show me and to start building in that space.
Okay.
I'm super excited because in my mental sort of scenarios, I've kind of imagined how things that we can do now in other ways, we could also do now with the spatialized digital milieu. And one example of that that I'll just go with here is that you know, the whole idea of the sensors, putting sensors on robots, you know, if you have a big milieu that is shared by everyone and that you can communicate across, the sensors don't have to be on the robots anymore. And instead of necessarily building a robot that can see this, all you need is a robot that can tap into the milieu, and then you have other specialized devices that can see. So suddenly even the idea of what technologies need to be integrated with each other starts to dissolve. And I'm looking forward to people playing with that to develop these kind of interactions.
I'd like to see a model of that as well. Thank you very much.
Can't wait. Anyway, sorry, on to others if others have any. Thank you for the discussion. It's awesome.
Another small question, responding to what Paul Pongaro just said. If Marshall McLuhan were joining us today as another Canadian, since we're all joining you in Canada, and you could ask him one question or he could ask you one question, just in the sense that, to me, the simplistic view of his media as message is from the tangible side, one of the more insightful few words I've ever come across. Most of his work I don't really think I understand very well, but I'm just curious, again, if you were joining us or an AI channeling him were joining us and he were to ask a question of you or you of him, do you have any clarity what that would be?
That's a really interesting way to frame it. I think some of the big pieces that would come through a conversation like that might be about where the agency lies and the impact of objects with agency, and this idea that the medium is now, like, you know, if the medium is the message, a lot of that has to do with how we perceive it as humans and in what context we're going to perceive it as humans. So now we have the ability and the opportunity to create different kinds of contexts. And I think there's been a vector in technology and in content and in distribution of technology, like TV, films, this kind of content, of packaging an experience and giving it to somebody. And I think what I hope this vector can bend slightly, or we can find other ways of creating a vector that is actually much more co-created, much more empathetic, and much more mutual, where as the content creator, I'm not packaging the entire experience for people, but rather I'm creating a set of potentialities that live alongside another set of potentialities created by maybe an entirely different content creator, you know. And it's in flipping that so that the agency now lies in the receiver of that content, that I think we would maybe be able to do things that McLuhan wasn't necessarily seeing in the way media was progressing and what he was talking about. I mean, super interesting question. I'd love to have that conversation with him, or anyone else who's studying him or channeling him. I'm seeing lots of chat things come up here, but I can't read them in time while I'm talking. One more thing I just want to say on that note is that one of the things that I'm trying really hard to do with the layered idea of the spatialized digital milieu is that it can coexist with other technologies. So if you do need to create, I mean, I'm not talking about replacing the technologies that we have. And often people think when something new happens, you have to be out with the old and in with the new. And I really think it's important that we recognize that a lot of the command and control stuff and a lot of the networking stuff and a lot of the security stuff and a lot of the, I mean, all the privacy stuff, a lot of the stuff that we're doing, and if you want a robot to do a very specific thing, awesome, go for it. And the milieu can exist on top of that. You can integrate it within. So I see a lot of leaving people, so goodbye to those who have to go. And thanks for hanging out with us tonight. And you can tell I'm passionate about this and I want to keep talking. So we'll talk again and some more.
Thank you, Matt. Congratulations.
Thank you for coming. Thank you. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing. That was really exciting and worthwhile, the long wait. And
it was
nice.
really fun for me.
Do you want to turn off the recording?
I will turn off the recording. Thank you.
So we can go off.